Please, if I fade out or anything happens, please let me know, anybody, if you can't hear, okay? Well, I love Pope Francis. And what and more, as I go about, I come to realize that I'm not the only one who in some way or other is moved by his ministry. It's pretty clear on a national, even international level, that he has caught the imagination and the heart and quickened the sense of faith in lots of people. It's not uncommon for me in my rounds to meet Jewish friends, Muslim friends, friends who have no religious faith that I'm aware of, who say to me, "What do you think of our new Pope?" Which says a whole lot to me. A second indication I have in my own personal rounds is whenever I make reference to Pope Francis in any kind of presentation, people, and I hate to say this, wake up. That's very humbling for me to say that. But somehow people are interested in him. They like him. They feel inspired by him. They wish him well. They pray for him. In this lovely series that the parish has planned for Lent, you're going to hear a lot about some of the very basic themes of his ministry. You're going to hear about mercy, which is very rich in his teaching and his experience. You're going to hear a whole lot about getting out and going to people rather than waiting for people to come to us. You're going to hear a good deal about his constant call and reminder to all of us that in the end, Christ is the heart of it all. And that if we don't start there, we're weaker, less compelling than God wants us to be. No matter how convicted and firm we may be about this or that aspect of our moral teaching or dogmatic history, if we don't start out of union with Christ and love for Christ, it becomes out of proportion and ineffective in today's world. I think you'll recognize, too, I can't name all the publications, and there's no point to doing it, but since his election, he's been Times Man of the Year. He's #1 leader in Forbes magazine for leadership in the world. For reasons I still don't understand quite well, he's been on the cover of Rolling Stones, among many other publications of note. He will, as far as we know, address the United Nations when he comes here in the fall, and he will address a joint session of our Congress. Somehow this man has caught on in ways that are just very stirring and stimulating. What I'd like to do this morning is basically touch on three things. One, I'd like to share with you my own experience of what attracts me in him, what in him attracts me. Secondly, I'd like to make a quick comment on some of his own personal background that helps me to understand what he is about and made him what he is today. And lastly, just touch on a couple of areas that are his priorities and my hopes for them. All of this finishing about 11:15, so don't mind. I mean, that's my understanding of the, let's put it this way. This is officially over at 11:15. And if you leave, we'll all salute you and thank you for being here. If you stay beyond 11:15, so will I, and we'll continue. But my initial impression of Pope Francis, Pope Francis, came at the very moment of his election. Was it March 13th in 2013? Yes. I was at the prayer center in Canandaigua with a group of our priests. They had invited me to lead them in a day of prayer, which is typically a morning talk and an afternoon talk with lunch in between and wonderful socialization between the jigs and the reels. I was in the midst of a brilliant presentation to them. I was even moving myself by the grace and wealth of my words. And all of a sudden, to my right about where the gentleman in the red jacket is, I heard cried out, "White smoke, white smoke," and realized immediately that one of our priest's sense of values was totally out of whack. He was watching Rome's activities on his iPad. And it was Father Bill Laird, by the way, if you see him, to remind him. Well, I said, "Bill, we need to stop, and, this is historic. We need to." No, he said, the fellow said, "No, it's going to be an hour before he comes out on the balcony. Why don't we continue?" So we did. I later on found out, to my great disappointment, that the current pastor of the cathedral was also on his iPad at that moment. I'll say no more about his behavior all day long. But there were many iPads there that day, and when we finished our formal program, we watched as Francis came out on the balcony. To me, that was the seminal moment in which I knew somehow this man was very special. And it is from that moment, which I'll describe in a moment, that I make sense of everything that he does. I think you know the moment I'm referring to. He came out on the great loggia in the facade of St. Peter's, much more simply dressed than was the custom. I must confess, I don't notice details, and that escaped me until later. But after a sort of a kidding reference to the cardinals having to go to the ends of the earth to find a new pope, he said to the thousands and thousands of people in St. Peter's Square, "Before I would presume to bless you, I ask you to pray over me, not for me, but over me, carrying a sense of blessing and anointing and confirmation." You may remember the moment, have any of you ever been in St. Peter's Square? Many, many people. You know it's not the most quiet place on earth, do you not? It is lively, in motion, noisy, beautiful. People from all over the world are there. When he made that request, bowing his head, you could hear a pin drop in St. Peter's Square. Immediately, people responded to him. What impressed me so deeply, now this is my language, my imagination, my association, was that he was saying to the people assembled there, and in saying it to them, to all of us, "I am from you, and I am for you. And we'll all grow and come closer to Christ if we remember that we're one body, and that without anyone here, we're weaker than God wants us to be." And if you think about much that he has done since, at least let me keep it personal to myself, I see in many things that he has done since precisely that fundamental principle lived out. For example, he invites conversation. "Come, let's talk about what's on your mind." I don't think you've ever heard him say, "We can't talk about that." Rather, he continually invites. One example was at the recent Synod for Bishops, for family and family life. His encouragement to them, and he urged them strongly, speak honestly and listen humbly. Don't refrain from saying something because you think I might not agree with you. Do not refrain from saying something because you think your colleagues here will not agree with you. Speak your mind, because if you don't, you enfeeble this effort. And we don't have on the table all the resources God gives to us to move more deeply and effectively into the pastoral service of family life. That's one example. To go back to those initial moments, I'll just name a few, and by association you can think of your own. I love the image of his schlepping up to the checkout desk at the hotel he was in, whipping out his credit card and paying his bill. I love the image of his, just got an extension to 11:30. But if you want to leave it to 11:15, you're still go blessed. But in those early days too, I think a very significant choice was the one he made of his residence. Now, many of you have said you've been in Rome. Did you ever get across seeing the Casa Santa Marta, where he now lives? It's in Vatican territory, inside Vatican City. Now, please don't imagine that as a lean-to or some hovel in which he's now living. It's a very lovely structure. It has beautiful rooms. Typically, they're a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom. There may be others with larger suites. I don't think there are, though. But it's quite nice. So it's not as though he decided to live there because he felt the papal apartments in the Vatican Palace were too posh or luxurious for him, although indeed they're just filled with precious artworks, and they are gorgeous, no question about that. But his stated reason for going to the Casa Santa Marta, I need to live in community. I don't want to be alone. And he has enfleshed that in his daily life at Casa Santa Marta, where typically he celebrates the daily Eucharist with those who happen to be guests in that place, and I assume other guests who are invited to come in. He meets them as they assemble in the chapel each morning. I'm Jorge, what's your name? No, I beg your pardon, I'm Francis. And then you say his name. So there's that simplicity, that easiness, that sense he communicates, as he did seminally on the loggia, I'm one of you, living out the dictum that Augustine offered many, many centuries ago when he said to his people, for you, with you I am a Christian, for you I am a bishop. And though I can't quote it literally, the sense of his following words were, the former, that is being a Christian with you, is a great pleasure, not so much the other part. Because he felt, given the power of that office, he could do harm, and he dreaded that thought. I do think Francis communicates that sense, and I think that's a huge part of his appeal. I am one of you, and I am for you. I understand you. Not that I know all the answers, but that I am willing to search with you for a more faithful living out of the gospel. Does that resonate with some of your impressions of Francis? Yeah. Another couple of examples that moved me very much. You may recall the gentleman who was seriously disfigured by external cysts and tumors all over his body, his face, his neck, every part of him. That Francis spotted him in an audience, and mind you, Francis is not the first pope to embrace the ill. That's not at all so. And indeed, for years, they've had a special privileged place for wheelchairs and the infirm close up at audiences. But in this given instance, Francis saw this man, and he went over and closed him in a long embrace, sort of cheek to cheek, and his arms around him that way. It caught the attention of many photographers, and it was around the world. But the man who was so afflicted and who received that embrace, said when questioned later, "You know, all my life, people have looked at me and turned away, and I felt so alone. But this man came and held me to his heart, and it made all the difference in the world." What a beautiful, nonverbal teaching that was. Maybe a chance a little bit later for you to share some of those memories, so let me stop there. But he right away attracted me, and right away his agenda caught my imagination. That agenda includes, among some of its great elements, a couple of things I've already mentioned, and this is all going to be picked up in the next 4 weeks. But once again, to stress on the mercy, the outreach, the acceptance of the individual, being centered in Christ. Within that framework, in order that his priorities not be just words, he has taken steps, very concrete steps, to bring about the kind of reform he was elected to bring about. I think you're all aware that it was very clear that his agenda for the pontificate, his hope for a new pontificate, aware that he'd be the Pope, was reform of certain elements of the administrative church that were being seen by bishops around the world to be obstructive and seen to be an unnecessary and sometimes intrusive layer between the bishop and his local church and the Holy Father. As you might expect, that's not an easy ride, is it? You know, these things are in place a long time, and I'm not calling these persons bad people in the Curia. I'm saying we all can get entrenched, can't we? We can dig in. Well, we've always done it this way, and who are you to say otherwise? But he's made some changes that are quite significant on that principle that he wants to hear from the church. So he's got the 9 cardinals, is it now, who come to Rome every month or so to advise him on questions. He's replaced a couple of members of the Congregation for Bishops, which is largely responsible for the appointment of new bishops in our church, because they clearly and publicly sort of disagreed with his direction. He didn't do that gracelessly, but it was a pretty clear message. He's revitalized the synod, as I indicated just a moment ago. He wants people to use their gifts, to share them with the church, recognizing, I think, with profound correctness, that we're all part of the body. And as St. Paul says, we all have our gifts, and without any one of the gifts, we're less than the Lord would want us to be. He came to the conclave, and everybody knew he would favor reform. I think it's not a leap at all to assume that the conclave, all the cardinals who elected him, by their election of him, endorsed that agenda. And it's my impression in these still early days that they are supporting him as, by and large, as he might hope they would. Let me say a couple of words about Francis. What I knew about Francis that day when he was elected, I could write on a small index card. I didn't know much about him at all. I knew he was a Jesuit. I knew he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. That's about it. And I had heard over the years that he was a very wonderful bishop in Buenos Aires, much concerned for the poor. But intrigued as I was by all of his early words and gestures, I began to read about him. One book that I'll mention to you, it's called Untying the Knots by John Vallely, who describes 2 deeply significant, formative elements in Francis' background. I'll mention them very quickly. One was his experience as the Jesuit superior of all the Jesuits in Argentina. He was appointed to that post after only 2 years of ordination as a priest. Yeah, I had the same reaction. Yeah. And it did not go well. It did not go well at all. It was close to disastrous. He never finished his term. And when he finished his term, as sort of a save your face kind of gesture, his superiors sent him for graduate studies in Germany. Now, he's a smart man. He knew things hadn't gone well, and says of those years himself, now, he said, I didn't realize how I failed to exercise my authority in constructive ways. I was too authoritarian. I didn't hear the voices of those I was named to serve. That's not an easy thing to say, but he said it directly, humbly, and honestly. While he was in Austria, he went into a church and he saw a picture, a painting of Our Lady of Untying the Knots, it's called. It's of the Blessed Virgin taking the knots out of a long cord that is knotted in several places. And the artist's conception was, here is the Blessed Virgin helping the human family recover from the sin, the knots that were tied by our first parents and many others of us through our history. He keeps that image on his night table. If you ever get a chance to see it, I don't know art very much at all. I don't think it's of any great artistic distinction, but its spiritual meaning for him was very powerful. The other element I wanted to mention is, and it's a very complicated thing, but it has to do with his use of authority as Jesuit provincial. There were 2 Jesuits who, in his opinion, were going beyond reasonable boundaries in putting into effect liberation theology. There was in the church in general, and even among the Argentinians and the Jesuits, Argentinian Jesuits, not just on the theoretical level, but debating liberation theology. But there was also a lot of conflict about how people live this out. Make a long story short, he issued an order to the two Jesuits who disobeyed his order. And so, and the head of that, they were expelled from the order by the general in Rome. He was asked to give them letters of good passage, if you will. That's not the technical term, but they were in good standing. He refused to issue those. Well, in the end, one of those men was murdered. Francis, though, as far as I know, everybody who's done serious research into that, save for one person, from all kinds of angles, would say that he was not responsible for that man's death. And I think Francis, in his heart, knows that, but he keeps saying, what if I had done something different? You know? Recognizing his own fallibility, his own humanity, his own weakness, his own capacity to mess things up. Well, I found that liberating, because he made me so aware that I needn't be so afraid of my own mess-ups over the years, or those that may happen in the future. Because he keeps coming back to Christ, who is the prime, full, transforming expression of God's mercy. And how often he says, don't ever stop asking for God's mercy, because God always desires to be merciful. That's a consolation. That's a gift. That's very powerful. So anyway, I would add only to the formative influences in Francis' life. I've named 2 of them. But you'll notice that his Jesuit spirituality, Father Salmon will really do a job on that next week. But if you're familiar at all with St. Ignatius' exercises, he lives them out in his papacy. Which is not to say all of us have to do it the same way, but it's his way of saying we needed to be rooted in our deepest truth before we can be credible witnesses of the gospel. Whatever that may mean for you or for me or for your brother or daughter or son or your parish priest or your bishop or your pope, that all of us have somehow to come to peace with who we are, which always includes the recognition that we are frail, can and do sin, need mercy and forgiveness. And on the other side of that coin, must always be ready to grant mercy and forgiveness after the example of Christ the Lord. Well, we came to our original 11:15 already, but I'm going to use the other 15. If anybody needs to go at 11:15, that's all right. But I just finish up quickly, and I'd like to leave some time for your observation or questions. One of the things Francis is teaching us, and I think this was in large measure enhanced, this teaching moment, much enhanced by his predecessor. What I think Francis is teaching us is that the Pope is not Superman. The Pope doesn't have it all in himself, and the Church must rely on him to supply everything the Church needs for its life and direction and pastoral programs. I think he's saying, and this is why he keeps saying, come and speak your mind. Let us know what's going on. I think that's his way of saying, you know, if you left it to me alone, I might not be any better as a pope as I was a Jesuit superior. He's applying the lesson. He knows he needs to be connected to the body if he's to be a credible head of that body. I mentioned Pope Benedict, who, recognizing that, said, my words, not his, as will become apparent, I'm not Superman either. I'm coming to a stage of my life when I just don't think I can handle this job anymore. I'm going to submit my resignation, which really stunned the world, didn't it? Because when did that happen before? And you know, nobody knew exactly what was going to happen thereafter. But it was a beautiful contribution made by that man. I'm not suggesting that Francis wouldn't be this way if Benedict hadn't resigned, but I'm sure he's deeply encouraged in his own humanity by Benedict's ability, humbly and honestly, to say it was beyond him anymore. So as we move forward, I think I indicated to you, I pray daily for his good health and long life. He will have lots of opposition. He's already had quite a bit, as you know from reading the press and various accounts, of people who feel that he's rocking the boat too much, leaving people uncertain, making them less confident than they used to be about how they interpreted and live the faith. I understand that, but I think the lasting good lesson of it is that in making us think, in challenging some of our set ways, and inviting us to do the same for him, he is trying to capture what is an ancient and beautiful, deep tradition in our church of the community assembled, so that the whole body can enjoy the wisdom of the community as best that's available to us. Obviously, you can't call plenary sessions of huge bodies, and so in the tradition of the church, that's done by representatives who gather in synod. That's what they've been called, which means moving together to look at the pastoral challenges of the day and to enjoy the wisdom of the Spirit involved in dwelling in every member of the body as to how to interpret the faith honestly, fully, faithfully, in such a way that it makes sense to and helps people of that time grow in the knowledge and love of Christ. I think he's done a masterful job of offering that leadership. I think the kind of leadership he's offering takes great courage, a great sense of dependence on God, and an ego that doesn't get in the way too much. Don't our egos always get in the way somehow or other? His probably does too, but by God, he's doing a good job with it, I think. So my hopes for him are that he will be able to effect, as he's strove to do in the Synod, an ongoing, all the structures that will allow the church, as a matter of course and routine, to assemble to do the kind of work the Synod is doing, reading the signs of the time, letting him speak to interpretation of our faith, tapping into the faith experience of people, this sensus fidelium, a term you're familiar with. What are the people believing? What are they accepting? With what items are they struggling? You can't just say, we said so, carry on. He's saying, no, if we're going to serve people, we have to understand their hearts. We have to understand their difficulties, as the beautiful opening words of one of the great Vatican documents were, their hopes and their dreams, their struggles, their failures, all that they yearn for. That's where the church needs to be. And I think that's where Francis wants to go. See, the danger, if I could, I don't think there's a dark side to Francis, but there's always since Vatican Council I, when the infallibility of the Pope was proclaimed as part of the doctrine of our church, there's always the danger, even as there was before that, to place too much in the basket of the Bishop of Rome. And I don't say it ever got there, but we can find ourselves moving in a direction that whatever the Pope says, and only what he says, means much in the church. I think that's a dangerous place to be. And I think Francis does too, and I think that's why he's moving to renew, or I suppose even create new fora that are stable and that continue from pope to pope, that would be understood as places where people could gather and reflect on their faith and make decisions appropriate and proper for the times in which they find themselves. I hope he keeps strength and lives long enough to put those structures in place. Well, there's lots can be said about Francis, and you're going to have some wonderful input in the next 4 weeks. Let me stop. Any quick observations yourself? What do you think of him? What moves you about him? What do you hope for him? They'd have to all to be kind of brief, if you don't mind, but we'd love to hear. Go ahead.
I would like to know a definition of liberation theology versus a lot of the things that he's doing.
Well, I think liberation theology starts at one of the sources of your theological reflections is this experience of people. And it's been criticized for being sort of a dialectic, therefore sort of communist sort of enterprise. I think in its best sense, it's not meant to be that at all. Rather, it's to be probably more powerfully expressed and thought of than what I was saying earlier, but in the same line. We can't do good theology. We can't develop effective pastoral programs if we don't know what the person in the street is coping with, including, I shouldn't say then, and as well as what they're coping with, what they believe, what moves them about Christ, how they find Christ in the circumstances of their lives. So it's much more complex than that, but
He's kind of there. In a sense.
Well, yeah, in that sense, yes, very much so. He wants to know what's going on in your lives. Yeah. Yes, please.
So what, I think it's interesting that Francis is focusing on family. Maybe as one of his first initiatives. And in the U.S., we have lots of different kinds of family, although I think we usually think of a family with mother, father, but that's not the case in much of America and throughout much of the world.
Yeah. Oh, you're right on. And that was at the heart of a very, very lively discussion in the synod so far. And that will be taken up again. See, this last experience you had was a preliminary session. The next will be the real thing. And every single item like that was on the agenda of the first, no matter how controverted and heated the discussion was, will be on the agenda in the second. The Pope made sure about that. So stay tuned for that, because that, what is today's family is very much a part of that. I mean, and we all know what you say is true, in spades. I mean, it really is. Yeah. Yes.
Is Pope Francis continuing to live in the modest apartment, or has he moved back to the Vatican per se? It seems religious leaders around the world really identified with him when he didn't stay in the Vatican per se, but had his own modest apartment.
Yeah. He's still living there, yes. Yes. And I don't see any sign, never heard any word that he was thinking otherwise either, yeah. Yes. Did you hear that question? Is the Pope still living in Casa Santa Marta? Yes, he is. Yeah. Sorry.
I think that one of the big things that Francis has going for him is that he's a Jesuit.
She thinks one of the great things Francis has going for him is he's a Jesuit. Save that for Father Salmon next week.
I mean, every one of my friends knows that. I was Jesuit educated at Boston College. My son is now at McQuaid. And like, I am walking on clouds because my son is being so transformed into this wonderful young man, and I know it's because of the Jesuits. And, I can see how, when he was at Superior and he was like dogmatic, the Jesuits aren't gonna let him get away with that. I mean, with a little encouragement, he came to himself, but I think it was, had a lot to do with the Jesuits.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. The observation is that this good person, woman speaking, is much enthralled by the Jesuits, having been educated by them, and now having her son being educated by them with wonderful good fruits. Praise God for that. Yeah, yeah. I share that. I was thinking on the way over this morning about Father Salmon for other reasons, but it made me think that Jesuit education, I had none up through and including undergraduate, I beg your pardon, high school. But after high school, I had the Jesuits for formal education for 7.5 years at the graduate level. And I'm forever grateful to them, not just for their academic training, but for their spiritual tradition, which several of them so generously shared with me over the years. But thank you. Yes?
I noticed that since Pope Francis became our Pope, non-Catholics seem to think he's really cool too. And conversations that I have with colleagues at work, they seem more open to the Catholic Church before they seem just frightened.
Yeah. Did you hear that in the back? That non-Catholic friends and colleagues seem very well disposed toward Francis, and it's her impression that they are more favorably disposed toward the Church by reason of his good witness. Yes, please.
What I find appealing about Pope Francis is I think he's showing us the face of Christ, and I'm very much grateful to him for that. And I attribute that's part of his Jesuit spirituality.
Yeah, yeah.
The Christ that we know through the gospel.
Yeah.
It's not that we've met the real Christ, but I think that's what makes him really attractive and powerful.
The observation is that Francis is so attractive and appealing because he shows us the face of Christ in the way that he lives. I've often, not exactly those terms, I've said to myself, people love him because he teaches as Jesus taught. It's not too far off from that, but that is in simple language, using gestures, examples from daily life. I think he's a powerful teacher that way. Yes, please.
I'm waiting to see how involved he is with the younger people, and I'm talking there, the ages 20 to
Yeah.
45, that seem to be not falling away, but looking at religion and spirituality in a
Yep.
And they are the future leaders of the church.
Yep.
And so I think that some of these things, like I just did the survey for the Family Synod.
Yeah.
Some of the things that are in that survey that are so troublesome to younger people, I'm anxious to see how soon there's movement and
Yeah.
what the outreach is
Yeah.
into that critical age group. We're old. We're not the church of the future. We're on our way to
Oh, come on, give us a break. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. The question is about Francis' impact on the young. And the observation quite correctly made is that we're not doing really well with the young these days. And we're not doing so well with the older folks either. The latest Pew survey from the National Research Institute for Pastoral Life says we're still experiencing a decline among adults of all ages who report that more and more, or less and less, religion means something to them. And that's kind of scary. But you know, I mean, and we have to pay attention to that. We have to be concerned about it. But you know, I agree with you, though I teased you. This is not what you call I want to be very delicate about this. You're right, there are a couple generations behind me, I know that. But you know, who's to say that we don't have tremendous power left? I hope that would never lead any one of us here to forget that we are the evangelizers of today. And by our encouragement, by our witness, by our respect and affection, by our accompaniment of generations behind us, that we can hope for something better. It's easy to look at our weaknesses and lacks, but there is enormous vitality in our community. And I cite this assembly, age notwithstanding, as a very, very good example of that. And I want you to be mindful through Lent of the opportunities you will have to say a word about Christ. Now, I don't necessarily mean a verbal contribution, but how you live and how you treat others and how you carry yourself with those with whom you differ. I don't have to say all, you know what I mean. We impact one another in ways we don't even realize sometimes. We just do. You think of people who have influenced you at one time or another and whom you've never mentioned that to. I bet you can think of somebody that has been a very powerful influence in your life and circumstances, or maybe just whatever it was, never led you to express that thanks. The other side of that coin, isn't it wonderful when people come to you and say, I want to thank you for something you did for me years ago. And you haven't the faintest notion what it is. But then they tell you. So don't be discouraged by bad poll results. Pay attention to them. Work with them. But don't let it get to your heart. Anthony.
Some of us
I'm
still-
shocked that you were asking a question.
Some of us still remember your first day as Bishop of Rochester. And I wonder if you'd mind investing at least a minute in what has transpired since.
12:30.
The perfect time to end, Father Kevin, right there. The question is, a lot of us remember your first day as Bishop of Rochester. Can you, in a minute, I'm serious, this is a quote, can you in a minute tell us what's happened in those years? That's 35 years ago. I often think of that day. That's references to the evening of my installation as bishop here, June 26, 1979. That was a memorable, pivotal, frequently returned to moment in my experience that contains, as Francis' gesture at the loggia contains so much that I see in him now, my experience that night contained so much that I've experienced over the years. That is, the goodness of the people I was called to serve, the ways in which those good people have formed and shaped my life and sustained me in the wilderness and celebrated with me on the mountaintop. So that's about a minute, Tony. That's about the best I can do. Listen, we did come beyond even 11:30. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Bishop Clark. We hope you'll return next week for Father Salmon's talk on the Jesuit spirituality that grounds Pope Francis. Thank you.
Reach always